Thanks everyone for joining us for our next Ripple Ventures Tank Talk with Ryan Freeman, Head of Enterprise Partnerships at DoorDash, to discuss managing enterprise partnerships as a startup. Welcome to the tank, Ryan.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Now, just a quick background on Ryan. Ryan is currently the Head of Enterprise Partnerships at DoorDash, where he's been for the last year. Before that, he was at Yelp as an Associate Director of Business Development and Corporate Development for 3 years. And prior to that, he was at Turnstyle, where he was a VP of Partnerships and Business Development, and joined Yelp after they got acquired in 2017. Prior to that, he was at Sierra Medical as a Senior VP of Strategy and started his career at Accenture as a Manager of Global Strategy for 4 years. Ryan, I'd love if you could tell us about your professional journey, starting out working in strategy and consulting roles at a global firm like Accenture, and the lessons you learned as it relates to transitioning into the tech ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I started, it seems like a lifetime ago, but I started as an intern between my third and fourth years of university at Accenture, and slowly worked my way through the ranks in both North America and Europe, ultimately ending up in a really interesting global group that was focused on supporting businesses either looking to expand internationally or rationalizing international operations across borders. Overall, I spent, as you said, about just over 4 years in consulting. I left consulting and reflect back on my time there with the belief that it's a really incredible training ground for the breadth of skills necessary for success in both the startup and the kind of big corporate ends of the tech spectrum. I think from a startup perspective, there are a few areas in particular that I think it breeds a strong skill set around. One is dealing with ambiguity for very different reasons. In the consulting world, the constant switching between industries and projects and functional areas, geographies, requires you to build a really kind of strong competency around comfort with and ability to put structure around ambiguity. And for very different reasons, that's equally as important in the startup space, driven by the constant search for product market fit, the constant experimentation with new tactics, that understanding and excitement about the fact that you really have no idea what tomorrow in the literal and figurative term is going to look like for the business is something that I think consulting does a good job of training around. And then I think the second is the focus on selling a dream and a vision. Again, it's something very different in the consulting context, but where you're kind of constantly pushing the boundaries of your clients' comfort levels for how they're thinking about their strategic planning, how they're building out their business, and the next horizons that they're trying to push through. It's a very different version of what selling a dream looks like in the startup world, but requires really similar skill set to convincing investors, partners, customers, and employees that what they're working towards is something well beyond what they may be able to see and touch on day zero of the conversation from a startup perspective. I think on the big tech side of the spectrum, the skill sets maybe, or the positioning that consulting creates might be a little bit different, though equally as valuable. I think, two areas I'd highlight. One would be navigating a web of internal and external stakeholders, something that is, really important in consulting, balancing the internal kind of functional and industry experts required to deliver the right guidance to clients and kind of the same on the client side. The big tech world, being able to get things done requires moving cross-functional programs along in a way that requires almost a level of diplomacy that I think consulting provides really good breeding ground for. And then the last is kind of polished communication. The bigger the organization, the more important and the more emphasis is placed on the ability to communicate kind of high quality ideas, high quality data insights in a polished and structured way. And consulting does a great job of positioning that.
That's an unbelievable training ground for any entry level career trying to go in any direction. I never even thought about consulting really when I was coming out of university. It was directly to Wall Street, and that was maybe a mistake in hindsight, given how successful you've been in your career. But I think just learning all those different things about focusing on the details, understanding how to communicate up and down the organization, selling a vision that they may not be comfortable with changing, and then also putting yourselves in the buyer's seat on what this means for the company and how this can change everything they've been working on maybe for the last decade is really something you don't get in investment banking. A lot of people call me and say, where do you think I should start after university if I want to get into tech? And my answer really is consulting. If it's not going into tech directly, it now has defaulted to consulting, and you probably have a lot to do with that. I'd love to transition to your role in startups and your move to Turnstyle in 2015, which I played a little bit of a role in. After advising the company for a few years, you joined them as a VP of Partnerships and Business Development. Can you tell us about those early days working for an early stage startup and trying to build relationships with large enterprise customers and partners and the struggles you faced?
Yeah. This is a great topic. Now, I think that the biggest challenge, certainly that we faced in the early days at Turnstyle, and I think this will resonate with you as you look across your portfolio, is the challenge of earning the right and the credibility to get a seat at the table. That is as relevant from a partnership perspective as it is from a sales perspective, as it is from an investor or financing perspective. But I think one thing I'll maybe go a little bit deeper on is from an enterprise perspective, because we were a disruptive technology, we didn't fit into a traditional enterprise sales cycle. We were using enterprise networking equipment to create marketing automation opportunities. And so one thing we struggle with is who do you sell that to? The CIO may be the cost center buying the technology, but it's the CMO who is realizing the outcomes. And I think that's actually representative of the kind of catch-22 that often comes with new technology, which is by design, it doesn't fit into an existing mold. And that's what makes it great, but it's also what means that the well-worn paths of sales aren't necessarily the ones that you can take. And so being able to, through high quality lead generation, through brand building, through networking, kind of earn that seat at the table is I think a big challenge that I didn't quite understand leaving kind of the world of brand name consulting and going into the startup space, but one that I think is pretty commonly felt across the industry. And ironically, that challenge is just as great in the partnerships landscape as it is in enterprise sales. And ironically, I think in many ways it was the partnerships that we were able to cement that in many ways created the solution to our enterprise credibility problem, in that by partnering with large established players in the ecosystem that we were operating in. In our case, it was with the enterprise networking OEMs and the big telcos. We were able to get our seat at the table with customers at a higher velocity and with lower friction than I think we would have been able to do if we had to build that credibility independently.
Right. It sounds like also trying to figure out, how to sell to the users and to the buyers differently was really hard as a startup. You think everyone is a user and you think everyone is a buyer, but everyone has very different motives, especially when you're selling to large enterprises. So how did you overcome that when you were trying to get a seat at the table? Did you have to come up with different strategies on how you were selling to each part of the organization? Or did you start with one place, try to make them your champion, and then get them to sell it internally for you? What worked for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is definitely an area where we stumbled around for a long time, and I'm not sure that we ever really found the silver bullet. But I think over time, the strategy that we found and that I have continued to find in subsequent organizations is that focusing on the user has been the most effective strategy. In that, if you can create a champion in the group and ultimately the executive who leads the group of stakeholders who will see value from the product or service, it's much easier for them to sell internally to the buyer than it will be for you to sell externally to the buyer.
Yeah, it's kind of like in venture when a startup is pitching, let's say, an associate or a principal, they really need to empower those lower level employees to sell it to the partners internally to get them to invest. It's almost the same thing when you're selling to the users at your customers. Empower them, get them to believe in what you're seeing, and then let them sell it because they know how to sell internally better than you ever will, no matter how long you build relationships for. So that's a great transition to the Yelp partnership / acquisition. In 2017, Turnstyle was acquired by Yelp for $20 million. Can you tell us how you played a role in that transaction and the lessons you learned in regards to negotiating with a U.S. public company as an early stage startup?
I mean, I think in all honesty, I can't take much of the credit for the transaction itself. I wish I played a more important role perhaps, but I think most of the credit should go to our finance leader, and sort of the CEO who did most of the negotiating, and frankly, our lawyers who did an immense amount of paperwork. But I think that the more interesting angle here is a really important takeaway for me is that the best way to position a company for acquisition, and frankly, I would say to answer the question directly, like my contribution, I suppose, to the lead up to the acquisition is that, the best way to position a company to be in that sort of position is to operate it as well as possible, as efficiently as possible as a standalone business. And I think, by creating scale, by creating growth and strong unit economics, of course, supported by a talented team and reliable technology, we did our best to ensure that the jobs of the folks who ended up supporting the deal itself, Liam and Devin at Turnstyle, frankly, nearly full time in those final weeks, had an easier lift than they would have otherwise if they were, selling something that lacked the strong foundation that I think we were very fortunate to have developed at Turnstyle.
Right. And it sounded like you had this mindset of there could be a day when an acquirer comes around or a large investor wants to join the business. We're going to have to do a bunch of work. So why not do it now before those conversations where we start to really dig into the details, which you learned probably at your time at Accenture, to understand the unit economics, understand our capital requirements and sort of our customer metrics and churn analysis and things like that, because we don't know when that buyer is going to show up and we want to make sure we're ready for it. And does that sound like what you were trying to accomplish even before this came around?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm sure there are lots of times where an acquisition is single purpose, where they're buying a team, they're buying a piece of technology, they're buying a relationship. But I think more often than not, they're buying a business. And to the extent that business can be well-rounded, built on solid fundamentals, I think everyone is better positioned. And I think that was our focus leading up to our partnership with Yelp, was making sure that Turnstyle was the most efficient, highest growth machine it could be. That happened to make it all the more attractive to Yelp.
Were there any mistakes that you felt occurred during the process or that you took personally that you rely on today after living through that?
Maybe only regret, and I'll say from a professional perspective, it was, I think we could have been quicker to integrate and to relocate down to San Francisco. It took the team about 6 months to kind of migrate the Turnstyle business south to San Francisco, which I think allowed for selfishly for me, allowed me to get married and do a whole bunch of personal things in Canada that I wouldn't have been able to if we had moved sooner. But I think from an integration, a post-merger integration standpoint, the sooner you can execute some of those heavy lift integration activities, the better. And so that's probably something that I would have done a little bit differently. But by and large, I think it was a really successful process on both sides, and one that I think has very few regrets, which is always a good sign.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you eventually made it down after getting married to San Francisco, and you worked at Yelp in a couple different roles, but you worked on the partnerships and corporate development team. And one of the partnerships you worked on was the Yelp Visa SMB deal. What was that experience like, and what lessons do you have for early stage startups working with companies like Visa on strategic partnerships?
I'd say the bigger the partner, the longer the process, the bigger the prize. I think, you brought up consulting earlier, and maybe to go back to my consulting time a little bit, this is the perfect opportunity to reference a 2x2. And if you think about effort and reward as the two axes here, large financial services organizations, large infrastructure players, folks in the healthcare world are the archetypical examples of that top right quadrant, where in order to capture that really high reward opportunity, to access that scale, to tap into that sort of whale opportunity, requires really significant effort for a range of reasons. I think most importantly is that those types of businesses have a substantial core business that they need to protect, and they need to make sure that any incremental move for their business certainly doesn't jeopardize that core and only enhances it. And so I think it was a really interesting exercise in experiencing the probably overused analogy that it's like that a big partnership is like steering a cruise ship. It takes a long time to change course, but once you do, the momentum and the energy around it is immense. And I think this was a great example.
Well, you obviously had a great time when you were at Yelp, but you decided to come back to Canada and join DoorDash as the head of enterprise partnerships. I'd love to understand what excited you most about joining DoorDash to help run their Canadian business.
Yeah. I think, as you said, I had just moved back from San Francisco to Toronto, and on a personal note, was in a kind of period of a big kind of personal change. We had just moved back. My wife and I had just moved back to Canada. We were expecting our first child, just settling into a new home. And so, I think with it's important context, because that was a lot of the framing around my decision-making process. But I think there were three big elements to the excitement for me around the move to DoorDash, and frankly, the three areas that made it a no-brainer decision for me. The first was, from an industry perspective, I think there are no more interesting problems than trying to solve the fundamental human challenges of solving for food, shelter, and sort of safety and healthcare. And I think in this situation, food being one of the most universal opportunities to tackle was something that was really exciting. Something that we had touched on a little bit at Turnstyle, and our focus in kind of the SMB side of restaurants, leaned in a little bit more heavily at Yelp, given their focus on the restaurant and hospitality space. And so an area that I've been excited about for a long time, an area that in large part driven by last mile logistics, was seeing a lot of disruption. And so when the opportunity emerged at DoorDash, for me, it was a segment of the industry that felt really exciting. The second area is sort of the phase at which I found DoorDash, last summer, in that there was very strong product market fit for the product and the technology in the US. DoorDash was the established market leader, but was in its very early days of entering the Canadian market, in many ways as a challenger brand, which for me was an exciting and new opportunity to take a business that had found product market fit in one segment into a wholly different segment. In this case, a new market, one that superficially may look and feel the same, but under the covers is a very fundamentally different market, I think, as every Canadian would be quick to point out. And then I think lastly, and this goes back to that personal context that I alluded to earlier, is kind of the culture and the lifestyle that became very quickly apparent at DoorDash. And for me, what was really important to identify was a place and a culture that is entrepreneurial day to day, but that has a little bit more predictability and stability long term. I think, the way that I tend to describe what I was looking for, and frankly, what I have found, is that I don't want to know what my day is going to look like tomorrow, but I want to know that I'll have a job in 90 days. And so, you can think about it as kind of the stage in the maturity life cycle of the business. And for me, DoorDash was in that Goldilocks zone.
Yeah, it sounds like it absolutely was a perfect fit for you personally and in your career-wise. I mean, I always ask you, what's it like being a Dasher driving around on your periwinkle blue Vespa around the city?
Yeah. Well, I wish I had the Vespa, but I will say every DoorDash employee does need to do a dash at least once a month to make sure that we kind of live and breathe a full three-sided marketplace on a regular basis. And so I can assure you, it's a great experience. If you haven't given it a shot, you should.
I absolutely love that. Well, I'd love to focus on the topic today, which is managing enterprise partnerships as a startup. When is the right time for startups to start looking for partnership opportunity? And is there a bad time?
Yeah, this is a really, really big, meaty topic. I would say that there isn't a necessarily bad time, I suppose. I will say, though, that, maybe one piece of advice is not to jump in too soon, in that partnerships are often seen as the quickest way to scale X, whatever X, it might be from a marketing perspective, might be from a product portfolio or breadth perspective, geography. I mean, there are a bunch of different vectors to look at that on. But I think, a partnership is a commitment that you will bring something to the table, and so will the other entity for some period of time. The more your business changes, the less stability there will be in your half of the value exchange. And while that may not be a deal breaker, it makes it more difficult for both sides to invest in creating the long-term value that the partnership is meant to achieve. And so I think if the earlier stage, the startup, the more by definition that business needs to be oriented around agility and constantly experimenting and testing new business models, new go-to-market strategies, new product offerings, which makes it, almost in kind of a linear correlation, equally difficult to agree to long-term commitments that will lock in those business models, those go-to-market strategies, those pricing models, et cetera. And so I think a good way to think about it is like, what are the core components of value that each side of the partnership is bringing to the table? And if there is a strong possibility that your ability to deliver your half of the bargain is going to change as you experiment with some of these core principles of the business, then it might be too soon.
Yeah, I mean, I guess let's back up a second. And what would you define a partnership as it relates to startups and, let's say, enterprises, rather than just a typical enterprise SaaS agreement or sales agreement for everyone out there to understand? Because there's so many different ways partnerships can be sliced and diced. It can be, reselling. It could be revenue sharing. What do you think it refers to when early stage startups are saying the word partnerships?
That's a good question. I think there's probably two ways to look at that. One is I suppose like nature of the deal, and two is outcome that you're looking to achieve. I think in terms of the nature of the relationship, everything's a spectrum, and in this case, I think a customer kind of vendor relationship is highly standardized, highly replicable. The other end of the spectrum would be kind of a pure play partnership, which is highly bespoke. You're creating a one-off deal structure meant to facilitate a by design unique relationship. Of course, there are a million shades of gray between the two poles on that spectrum. And I think it's in the middle there, especially in enterprise sales, where every deal does tend to look a little bit different. And so it may feel a little bit like a partnership, even though it's, the objective might be more on the traditional sales element. So to that second half of the definition, I think the objective plays a strong role in that delineation, to the extent the delineation is even helpful. But I think on the sales side of the equation, the objective is to generate revenue in exchange for the delivery of your core product or service. On the partnership end of the spectrum, it is an exchange of value that isn't cash for product. And again, million shades of gray in between. And so there maybe isn't a clear definition, but the closer you are to one pole or the other, I think the more clear cut it becomes.
No, that makes sense. I think it's easy to say, if this doesn't look like every other enterprise sale that you're doing, and it's a one-off bespoke type of, customized contract or negotiation, that's more like a partnership. And then to talk about sort of, is there a bad time? I do think there is a bad time. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. It's probably if you haven't done enough enterprise sales on those sort of repeatable enterprise sales building relationships, and you're being thrown into a one-off custom relationship that has not very clearly defined outcomes because you haven't gone down this path before. That's probably a bad time to start there if you haven't even done any traditional enterprise sales agreements before, wouldn't you say?
That might be the case. And I think to the extent that it's a new arena for the business, it will make the deal process and the value realization from the deal more difficult. Though I wouldn't say it's necessarily an absolute, no-go deal breaker, in that it depends a little bit on the objective of the partnership. If it's a revenue generation partnership geared towards sort of replacing or supplanting what a traditional enterprise sale may look like, then you're probably right. If it's more of a product partnership or something a little bit less focused on immediate revenue generation, then there may still be room for partnerships to play a pivotal, relatively early role even before enterprise has been unlocked as a customer segment.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So since startups often partner with much bigger established companies, what can they do to avoid or reduce being taken advantage of, in your opinion?
This is a great one. And I think that this actually comes down more to mentality than anything, technical or legal in nature. I think that in a partnership, regardless of how big you as a startup may be versus how big the other entity may be, no one is doing anyone any favors. And if they are, they aren't running their business very, very well, nor are you. You as the startup are bringing something real and something valuable to the table, or your counterparty wouldn't be sitting at it with you. And as in any negotiation, it's up to you to remind them of why they're in this in the first place. I think as for muscle, they'll likely have more and more expensive lawyers than you and folks on their finance team doing fancier modeling than you, which makes it all the more important to identify the important terms that make the deal a win for you, and ensuring that those don't get eroded over time. But I think more than anything, it's about mindset and knowing and reminding yourselves that you don't owe the other side anything. You are bringing real value to the table. That value is, by definition, valuable to the company you're negotiating with. And so, you have both the right and the ability to be firm on those elements of the deal that are critical to your business.
Yeah, it sounds like pushing back against these much bigger established companies is okay and is often the right thing to do if it's mission critical to your core beliefs as a startup. Yes, you're right. I've seen tons of advanced models created by partnership teams at the corporate level that don't even comprehend anything in terms of value. They're just a lot of numbers on a page. But if that's okay with their process and that's how they want to do it, that's fine. But if it's totally overshooting what it is you're trying to achieve at your company level and it doesn't align with them, then you shouldn't even be going into that deep dive model. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that makes total sense. When you initially start a partnership negotiation, that process can be very lengthy and there's a lot of key things that get thrown into contracts from out of left field. What are some key items that startups should look out for or request at the very beginning of that process?
Yeah, there are probably a bunch of great, financial and legal elements that are kind of like must-haves, must-dos that other folks can contribute or advise around, or there's got to be a list that someone's published out there. But I think the most common gotcha that I see, and frankly that I've learned about the hard way, is the need to get two things very clearly and in writing upfront from whoever's on the other side of the table. One is what that company wants to get out of the relationship. It's often easy to get blinded by the fancy logo or the number of zeros in your modeling about what this relationship can do for you. But if you don't know exactly what's in it for the other side of the table, it risks ending up just being a signed piece of paper that doesn't actually result in much. If you don't know how to incentivize the other side of the table from an operational perspective to make sure it's contributing to their outcomes. And then the second, and probably the most important and the most difficult, is getting an understanding for how much they're going to invest internally to make this a success. This isn't as much about the sexy stuff like marketing dollars and sort of like those high level commitments, but this is the unsexy stuff, the sales training, the compensation targets that they're willing to goal their sales and marketing teams against, the specific real estate on their digital assets that they're willing to dedicate to your shared business, the engineering resources that they're willing to commit to put against making a success from a product or a UX perspective. It's those really boring, back-end, unsexy operational conversations that will make the wheels turn. And those are the things that are most often left out of contracts, which are typically driven by the legal needs to codify things like liability and indemnity and insurance, often at the neglect of like the slightly lower risk and lower exposure elements of operational cooperation that unfortunately are the things that actually result in value realization, even if they don't directly relate to kind of protecting against downside risk.
Yeah, I feel like so many CEOs shoot right to the last page of the contract, which says how many zeros are they going to get out of this if it actually works. And they totally leave out the details of how much money are they putting towards this project, what outcomes are they expecting from a non-monetary perspective, and how much horsepower are they willing to put behind this, even if it doesn't work out as planned? Because that's often the case too, right? There's a 6 to 12 month lag before it really starts to ramp up and show value to you as a startup. Well, that's when they should be spending time building on it. So what would you say to a CEO who's having his first or second partnership meeting and they're throwing out, these millions of dollars in revenue, the potential that they can generate for them? Would you advise them to say, pause, don't even tell me about those numbers yet? What are you willing to put on the table here?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, well, I wouldn't temper any of the big numbers because those are fantastic. But what I would say is come to the next meeting with a really clear set of like conversation starters backed up by expectations around what you think the prospective partner would need to commit operationally to realize those dollars. And if you don't have a perspective, then ask them to come with a perspective, because if they don't have that, and if you don't have that, then you're in deep water here, because the more zeros, the more difficult it's going to be to actually realize. If there's no clear plan in place, the lower the likelihood it's actually going to happen.
Do you get a sense of when it's okay to stop the partnership conversation, when you're not seeing, either the, corporate side moving fast enough, not putting enough attention on this, dragging their feet? When should you come to a decision on, this is not going to make sense for us at this time, we'll come back and revisit this in 6 to 12 months or something?
Yeah, I would say, sooner rather than later, because if nothing else, your ability to demonstrate a willingness to take your foot off the gas and frankly shelf the partnership. If there is more momentum and more buy-in on the other side of the table than you thought and that you were giving them credit for, that'll be a surefire way to get them to kind of admit that and play their cards a little bit more honestly. But if there's no more valuable resource to a startup than time, and to the extent that you start to feel like you're spinning your wheels and wasting time on these negotiations, I always find it most helpful to just make that clear to the other side. Of course, in a diplomatic and in a very respectful way, but make it clear that either the conversation isn't moving fast enough to make it worth your while, or isn't headed in the right direction to make it worth your while, and that all else being equal, your preference would be to press pause if this is the expected trajectory, and give the counterparty an opportunity to either commit the resourcing or revector the conversation in a way that makes it more appealing.
Yeah, it makes sense. One last question before we move on from this. What are your feelings towards exclusivity on both sides?
I think I'd have the same answer to the question, how soon is too soon, or how do you know when the right time is to start with partnerships or to make it a core part of the business, in that exclusivity is the most extreme form of bet that this is absolutely the right direction for your business, the right partner to be in, the right terms to commit to. And so I am extremely comfortable with exclusivity, and in the right circumstances, very pro exclusivity, but it requires a very strong level of conviction that this is absolutely the right, very narrow direction for both businesses. And so the earlier stage the business model, the less likely it is to make sense, because the less likely it is that you can realistically have that level of conviction in a set of business decisions. And so I would say exclusivity on either side of the table should not be taken lightly, and should be used as a very large and blunt instrument that can have dramatic impacts, the way any hammer can, but one that needs to be wielded carefully and only when the nail requires it.
I like that answer. Very Accenture polished. So from your perspective, at what point does it make sense for partnerships to become a focus for the company strategy? And how would you advise startups to go about building up their initial pipeline of partnership opportunities?
I think on the pipeline side of things, I think the best way to start is to think through the adjacencies to your business that you wish you could build or have today, but can't, either for lack of resources, expertise, access, etc. And I think that helps create the universe of reasonable places to start. Of course, not all wish lists, or not all line items on the wish list are created equal. And so depending on the business, you kind of need to wait and prioritize them. But I think once you've identified what part of your business can most benefit from partnerships, from using third parties to augment what you do internally, then it's about finding the right folks to work with. Values alignment, willingness to move at your pace, at a shared pace, that have an overlap from a target customer and a sales strategy standpoint. Depends a little bit on what the nature of the partnership is, but I think it's identifying the areas where partnerships can be beneficial and where it makes more sense to partner than to invest in building internally, and then create a really kind of strong set of criteria for what what will make the right partner, given the nature of your business, what you're looking for, your culture, within that smaller segment.
I find that like partnership opportunities come around when, your salesperson is talking with an enterprise customer and then it evolves into a partnerships and either they run with it, but they treat it like an enterprise sale and it definitely doesn't work out as planned, or the CEO ends up getting involved with the partnership conversation, not thinking they were going to be ready for partnerships. And they're just sort of like flying by the seat of their pants, trying to figure out how to get this partnership over the finish line. And so it's really important to have people who've gone through this partnership process before, either as advisors or mentors or some type of investors. Rely on those people rather than going at it yourself. Because a lot of these, initial partnership conversations do come out of left field, and you need to be ready for them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, building, whether it's an executive team, an advisory board, a more formal board of directors, or informal mentors who can act as the filter system and the advisory system as these inbounds come in, to make sure that as sort of the CEO or as the leadership team of the business, you're focusing your efforts on the partnerships that smell right off the bat and that will help move your business in the right direction is really important, and not something that can be done reactively, but proactively. It's a piece of infrastructure that every startup should have on hand to make sure that they can react in time and intelligently as these inbounds come in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at Ripple, you're an EIR for us on our partnership side. I strongly advise any startups to not go through a partnership negotiation on their own, especially the very first time, and especially with like a Fortune 500 company. It's not worth it. There's people there to help you. So definitely, Ryan or people like him are definitely there to help. All right. Well, I'd love to move to my favorite part of the talk, which are your book recommendations. And you have 3 amazing books here. Can you tell us about each one of these and why our audience should give them a read?
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully none of these have come up in the past. I think they're all somewhat unique, particularly the last. I think maybe one comment before going into the specific books, and what you'll see is that none of my recommendations are business books in the traditional sense. While there's undoubtedly value in understanding the genius of Steve Jobs or the greatest theories on change management, I'm a firm believer that the most interesting people I know are those with the broadest, most agile minds. People who can draw from a wide range of knowledge and experiences. I guess polymaths, even though that's very out of fashion in our hyper specialized world. And I'm by no means in that category, by the way. But to the extent I can move in that direction through reading, I think it's a really worthwhile endeavor. And so the first book here is How the Mind Works. This is a book that tries to explain the roots of human behavior through the lens of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. That is that how we act is driven by the relentless march towards adapting to the world in which we live or lived. And it was an extremely influential book for me in teaching me to constantly ask the why around how people act, and therefore how to better service their needs, which actually ties in nicely to my second recommendation here, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and actually the follow-up book to this called Collapse, also by Jared Diamond. It's a book that explores the underlying causes of Europe's ascent militarily as a sort of like a set of global powers. But more than anything, it's a great example that the explanations for what we see are often what we least expect. And a great example that what we need to do is go to the lowest level of detail to uncover the truth, and that it's easy to hypothesize, but it's much more difficult to arrive at a data-driven version of the truth. And this takes some of the most difficult and kind of messy questions around human nature and social evolution and military conflict, and tries to use geological and anthropological and sociological explanations for why things ended up the way they did in a really interesting way. And then the last book here, and certainly the biggest curveball, if there was going to be one, is Expecting Better, which is, as a relatively new father, I needed to throw this one in here. It has nothing to do with business, though I suppose something to do with partnerships in a more personal sense. But it's an incredibly helpful look at the real science behind the commonly held beliefs and commonly doled out advice on how to prepare for for parenthood and for a child. And again, has nothing to do with business, but is a true game changer for anyone about to have a child. So I needed to use this opportunity to recommend it in case there was someone listening who found themselves in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, the cover just says it all. Why sushi and cheese aren't so bad, but gardening could be. Wow, amazing book suggestions. Thank you very much, Ryan. And I always love to end off our talks with any final words of inspiration for our audience.
Yeah, I think, maybe I'll reiterate something I alluded to on the previous slide, which is the most interesting people, the most successful leaders are the people who have taken the most circuitous, least linear path in their careers. And so I think, last parting thought here is don't think about the next step in your career journey, the next step in your business progression as a linear set of steps that are supposed to fit a mold, but try to solve for the most interesting next set of experiences, whether it's for you as an individual, you as a company. I can guarantee that will better position you for future success.
Those are great words of inspiration and great words to live by. Thank you so much for joining us in the tank today, Ryan. I really appreciate it, and all your insights on partnerships and how startups can navigate the often confusing and sometimes complicated world of partnerships.
Thanks for having me, Maddie.